Hello and welcome to the
Homunculus
next
just
episode of the
means
Nad Node
little man
podcast.
or something like
We
that
have
in
a
Latin.
doozy
That's
of a
where the
podcast
word
today.
homunculus came
We are
from.
going to talk about homunculuses. And if you're wondering what is a homunculus, then you're in the right place because we're going to go there. This is going to be an open-minded conversation with things that may or may not be real. Open brain caps on and enjoy the ride and learn a little bit about alchemy, homunculuses, technology, AI. The title of this podcast is AI, the homunculus of the 21st century. To sum it up, the homunculus walked so that AI could run. I think that man through the ages has always wanted to become a god in some sense. And whether it's alchemy or technology, humans have a tendency to just take it a little bit too far. If you were to have asked me anytime in the past what a homunculus was, it would have rang some bells because I have a degree in biology. I took some neurology and brain and behavior type classes. We learned about something called the cortical homunculus. I'll have a picture up to show what a homunculus in terms of neuroscience is a really interesting, like humanoid looking weird creature. The cortical homunculus is a distorted representation of the human body based on a neurological map of areas corresponding to parts of the brain in proportion amount of to the brain space that body part occupies. The hands, lips, and tongue take up a lot of space because more of the brain is dedicated to those parts. That's what I thought of when I was with on the 2024 eclipse evening mentioned a homunculus. And so I thought that must be what they're talking about. But then overhearing what they were saying, I was like, wait, this is something different. And basically, what I was overhearing, this guy that I had just was there was a guy telling some of our friends about what a homunculus was and that you could make one. And trigger warning, this gets a little gross and a little gruesome. But basically, he was talking about using different animal body parts, body fluids, incubating it for a time, grow a little creature, a homunculus, a little buddy. I was sure that this was one wild, fake conspiracy theory, still could be story, like a creepypasta or something that this guy was describing. The homunculus sounded like something out of an old school Frankenstein's monster type of story, but it was enough to get me interested. And he was talking about using alchemy to create this little creature. So on our way home from camping at the eclipse, I started researching. Quickly, I find out the original alchemical recipe for making your own little homunculus. There was an alchemist named Paracelsus, and this was his recipe for making a homunculus. He was born in the late 1400s and was famous in the early 1500s for alchemy. He wrote the 9 books of the nature of things. And this is where we find the recipe for making your own homunculus. I'm going to read it verbatim. So again, I apologize if this is going to make you a little queasy. It's not great. So here we go. That the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in a sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in fermenting horse dung, what they call a horse womb, or at least so long as it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this time, it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent without a body. If after this it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood and be nourished for up to 40 weeks and be kept in the even heat of the horse dung, a living human child grows from there. with all its members like another child, which is born of a woman. That's crazy, right? When I was reading this, I was like, wait, what? So, just to digest that a little bit for you guys, the recipe is taking the sperm of a man and putting it in a horse womb and covering it so it putrefies, ferments for, I think, 40 days. After that, putting the arcanum of the human blood, which I think is some alchemized extraction of something from human blood. Don't ask me. Paracelsus is credited as the first recorded mention of creating homunculi, I think would be the plural for homunculuses. But it is believed to have had roots in many other cultures for many years, but less concrete written sources, just more like oral tradition. One other story that originated likely before Paracelsus is in the 15th century, the 1400s, and that is the story of the hanged man and the mandrake root. So Paracelsus was credited for in the lab, his alchemy lab, creating this, but the story of the hanged man and the mandrake root was like an in the wild, accidental homunculus creation. I think this was before the word homunculus had been given. But so basically, in or before the 1400s, in medieval Europe, they had a myth about a man who was a prisoner that was going to be hung for his crimes. And when he died on the rope in the gallows, his body spontaneously ejaculated, and the ejaculate falls to the ground. And then I don't know how much time passed when they noticed this, but they found a man-shaped root that was found in the ground. If you are aware of the mandrake root that is often like it looked like a humanoid creature, they found that and they were like, oh my gosh, this must have been from the hanged man's ejaculate. Lovely. I told you, this, guys, is a wild episode that you really just have to roll with it. It's pretty crazy. It was said that you could take that jizz root and incubate it in another disgusting way that I won't repeat, similar to the Paracelsus recipe. And fun fact, the mandrake root was actually used to help with pain and anesthetic for surgery. But apparently, if you take too much, it can induce hallucinations. It was also said that if you dug one up and you hear it scream, apparently they can scream, then you'll be cursed if you hear the mandrake scream. So back to Paracelsus a little bit, and alchemy is credited as the precursor to chemistry and modern day chemistry. And they were really focused on transmuting different minerals into gold or changing one substance into another substance. So most of the time, whenever you hear about alchemy, the main thing is being able to turn other minerals into gold. Like we all wanted to create gold since it's a precious metal. But for Paracelsus, he was into a lot more stuff than just gold. Alchemists often wanted to create immortality. And if you've heard the phrase, the philosopher's stone, that was the sought after elixir of life. If they can transmute these different substances, compounds, into this elixir of life to grant immortality. And in Paracelsus's 9 books of the nature of things, this homunculus was his recipe to create these little small humanoid creatures to perform various tasks for them. They're depicted as living in these like glass domes, and there are these little tiny guys living in these glass domes that you have to feed. They couldn't really exist outside the glass spheres, from what I'm understanding. I'm just talking about how it is portrayed in the alchemical sense. of things. So don't take what I'm saying as fact. I'm just reporting it as it's written. So these little homunculus guys could be trained to do various things. Some you could train them to create art, replicate art. They said there were some that could predict the weather, some that could predict the future. Yeah, they really, I guess you could just train them to do whatever. I'm not exactly sure the protocol on that. Paracelsus was the main alchemist that pioneered this. I'm sure there were others, but he's credited for the original recipe that everything else branched off of. And so later on in time, there was another proto-scientist. I use the term scientist loosely. A proto-scientist is a good way to describe that guy, named Jan Swammerdam. He worked in insect research, and he was trying to disprove metamorphosis, which I'm like, you really picked a bad hill to die on there. But he was in the 1600s, and during his research, he came up with a theory called preformation. So this guy pioneered the thought that one little sperm cell was a miniature man. It was a human contained within the sperm. It wasn't half of the equation, it was the whole genetic makeup. And basically, the woman's womb was no more than an oven. She didn't contribute at all to the situation. And there's some really funny, like little sperm pictures that are just like a little man curled up in a ball. Surprisingly, this theory was generally accepted for a long time, although it did have some haters. Shout out to our boy Darwin in the 1700s, who was a big hater for the idea of preformation, that it's just a little tiny man in there, put it in the lady's oven, and she cooks it. She doesn't give any of her own genetic material, which is obviously bonkers. But it actually wasn't Charles Darwin. It was his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and he was strongly against preformationism and agreed with the theory more in line with Aristotle's theory of epigenesis, where an adult is developed from a simpler, premature form versus a fully formed miniature human. Over time, more science continued to support an evolutionary sperm and egg genetic theory and genetic diversity coming from both mom and dad. And I think it's just like very indicative of the times and funny that it was accepted scientifically that the woman didn't contribute any genetic material. The voices of opposition to that were like, what's the deal if the kid looks like the mom? How can you explain that? And they would say that sometimes being inside the woman, there could be some absorbing of her genetics, but not surprisingly enough, if anything went wrong in terms of the health of the baby, or they were a bad kid or anything wrong, oh, the mother was so evil and horrible and sick or whatever that her evilness spread to the child. So if the kid was fully formed healthy, dad gets all of the credit for that. If there was anything wrong with the baby, the woman gets credit for that. Big eye roll on that one. I'm glad that science has gone further to prove, obviously, that is so far from the case. It just shows the amount of patriarchy that has been weeded out of our timeline and our history, that women in the past, they just had to deal with it. There was nothing they could do to prove it otherwise. Science was not the way it is, and the understanding of the human body, and especially reproduction and genetics, was close to nothing. So it was just coming up with these ideas on a whim. And thanks to scientific pioneers like the Darwin family, Charles's grandfather Erasmus, for being an outspoken hater of this. And now we have found that not only obviously the mother and father both give DNA to the child. Biology 101 on that if you need a refresher. We've also found that the baby gets 100% of their mitochondrial DNA from the mother. That goes through the mother's genetics. And so mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, you get that from your mama. So thank your mother for your mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. This idea of the homunculus just really latched on in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy writings. But what does this have to do with AI? The title is AI, the Homunculus of the 21st Century. And I firmly believe that history repeats itself. And I think science repeats itself is also true, because that drive of wanting to outsource the work is still innate in people today. And AI, artificial intelligence, homunculus, artificial, humanoid, it's strikingly similar. So there's alchemical records that show the homunculus were used and trained, like I mentioned earlier, on various tasks like art. We're able to foresee the future and even create other creatures like dwarves and giants. Don't ask me, I didn't go fully down that rabbit hole part of it because it's just too much. And it said that through art they are born, and therefore art is embodied and born in them because the alchemical process was a form of art. So they have this ability to create art and create things inside of them, and that they needed to learn it from no one. So intelligence of nature in a way. So somehow they had this innate intelligence that needed to be trained or just pointed in the right direction. As time moved on, the homunculus stayed in popular culture and alchemical culture for hundreds of years. In 1775, apparently, at the Vienna Masonic Lodge, there were 10 homunculi in glass spheres that were trained in various skills, one being future telling. And this was done by two people, two alchemists, Count Johann Ferdinand von Kufstein and Abby Galoni. And believe it or not, on the legitimate Guinness Book of World Records website, the Guinness Book of World Records that we all know, there is a world record for largest homunculi. I'm not kidding. It was one of these 10 created by Johann and Abby, recorded at roughly 30 centimeters tall. They were allegedly created in the late 16th century, and apparently Count Johann was a reputable person at the time, so there was some weight to his proclamations about this. I don't know who verified it. There's a little bit of information on the Guinness World Records website, but all the homunculi, each one was maintained in a sealed glass because if it were to be let out and touch normal air, it would die. And apparently it is said that the remains of these homunculi, because they did not live a very long time, I'm not sure exactly how long, but it seemed like they had a very short lifespan. And it's said that the bodies are buried on the grounds of the residence where they were made. And so reading about that and learning about these 10 different homunculi in the Masonic Vienna Lodge, doing various tasks, making art, making things, future telling. When I was doing this research, I'm like, it's like they're creating their own custom GPTs for their AI chatbot, AI image generator. And I just had the thought like, man, people throughout time have been trying to outsource the things that they want to accomplish to something else. It struck me that we haven't stopped. Science is repeating itself, history is repeating itself, and we're just using our artificial intelligence, technology and training these algorithms, training these AI to be what we want them to be, similar to the way they were training these homunculi to what they wanted them to be. Again, I'm saying all these things as if it's 100% real. I do not know. These people, like these accounts, it's on the legit Guinness World Records website. There's so much history about these things, but this was back when we didn't have photography. We didn't have ways to substantiate this. People could write these things down. So, take everything with a grain of salt. And how I'm speaking about it is in this little bubble of just pretending it is true for the sake of this conversation. Because it's just crazy. And, there are other ways of looking at this, pre-formation as more of symbolism, to where each man had the little man inside them that was their true spirit. And some that have these innate creative abilities that they say that the homunculus had innate abilities that these creatures had, but it's a reflection of this human inside of you that you can harness yourself. So there are some ways of, digesting this information as purely symbolic. And then there also are some religious interpretations of preformationism where it's like Jesus Christ inside of you, like from the Christian point of view, that, we all have Christ inside of us, kind of way of looking at it. So it's very interesting just how, and then there's others that are super concrete about, no, this is a legit recipe. You can make this, you can do this. It's bonkers. Like, it's so wild. The amount of different information out there on this from various historical sources. And I just think it's so fascinating that humans, although so much evolution of humanity and how we view life and everything has changed so drastically, and the lifestyle that we live is so different than 1400, 1500, 1600. But yet we're still kind of having and exploring the same theme. Like, man is just trying to outsource this work to something else, something less than human. Slavery was all around the world, and they were looked at being, 3/4 of a human. These inclinations that man has had to outsource the work is honestly mind-boggling. They can recognize that preformationism and homunculus have these innate creative abilities that came from them, but yet they aren't the ones that wanted to do it. They still wanted to outsource it. So it's like a weird mix of recognizing this creative ability within you while still trying to have a workaround, which is totally what we're seeing with AI now. And, having to outsource all sorts of things. I mean, there's so many people creating content, creating images, creating probably future telling, just like they had the homunculus do, to outsource the work, to get more done in a short amount of time. We have not let go of that weird obsession with just generating, outputting these things that we are fully capable of doing ourselves. I'm not saying that I don't use AI sometimes. At this point, it's in our faces. We use it for sure, especially having worked in the marketing field, and it's everywhere. But it's very fascinating that we are just diminishing our own creativity and saying, oh, well, I'm not creative. I can't do this. So I'm going to rely on a little grown. So I'm going to go ahead and grow a human to do these things. Like, be more for real. Just do it yourself. It's like a continuous game of passing the buck, trying so hard to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and thinking that having 10 custom GPTs outputting all these things, having 10 homunculus outputting all these things is going to bring you to a level in life that is higher than. Like, yeah, productivity is great, but if you're generating all these things, you have to sustain them still. And what you're outputting, if you're just relying on AI, it's not going to have soul with it. If homunculuses were real, I doubt they would have a soul necessarily to themselves either, you know? It apparently took quite a bit of resources to keep them alive. They couldn't live for a very long amount of time. You're just doing a runaround game of keeping these things alive, using all these outputs from your GPTs that are creating a bunch of content or business plans or, you know, whatever it is. But you actually still have to do it. It's creating more work that you can't push off past the buck to something else. So it's just humans are such funny little creatures. That was my main takeaway from this. As I was researching, the AI thing has gotten even more bonkers. And this next part that I want to talk about is called OI, organoid intelligence. So the thing about AI and technology in general, the internet in general, it requires a lot of energy. And it's an amount that is not entirely sustainable at all. And it is a worthy issue to try to fix. But there are some scientists that have gotten a little bit too creative. And that's where we get to organoid intelligence. So what is an organoid? It's a cluster of living human brain cells, which these scientists have wired into a biocomputing array, or like into silicon chips, computer chips, to decrease energy consumption and increase energy efficiency due to the brain's really amazing, spectacular ability to efficiently make and acquire cell connections, like the way our synapses work. It's a really efficient way of going from point A to point B and connecting information. Not only just the innate ability of neuron brain tissue, but also it learns. It can become more efficient. So they have made from stem cells and grown human brain tissue on silicon chips, and they're estimated to be able to store up to 2,500 terabytes. That's a lot of information. And so basically that information is stored on these organoid infused silicone chips. Imagine having 2,500 terabytes worth of information on one chip that is immensely more efficient in routing through, finding information, making connections, culling all the information to generate an output. These organoids, like, this is going to become new. We are going to see a trend in biocomputing. They're calling it brain aware instead of software. There was a $14 million investment by the US National Science Foundation to research ethical biocomputing research. To me, it's like we are living in some sci-fi time. AI is just the tip of it, like what we think, you know, like iRobot, those kind of sci-fi stories. That's just not even really, in my opinion, in the same ballpark to what organoid intelligence could branch off into. There's even some of these organoid, the larger ones that have photoreceptor cells, like a proto-eye, very simple, light sensitive cells that are going to be used on the organoid so that it can respond to light stimuli. The magazine Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology said that organoids are the 2025 trend. In January, they said that Harvard is investing money in researching what they can do. And honestly, it is bizarre. You can already buy server space from some European companies that you can use their computing power that are already using organoids. I'm not exactly sure where they're getting the brain tissue cells. I'm sure that information is out there. Could potentially be like stem cells that they are doing different chemical modifications to turn them into brain cells. And to me, it sounds a lot like alchemy, taking one substance and trying to transmute it into another. And I actually worked in a lab that doesn't have to do with organoid intelligence, but it has to do with stem cells. After I graduated with a degree in biology, I worked for a short time in a lab in the UNT Health Science Center that their goal was to have a cure for macular degeneration and a protocol that takes your skin cells and through a series of exposing them to certain compounds, change those skin cells into stem cells, into pluripotent stem cells that can then be put into the back of the retina that will then convert those pluripotent stem cells, which are stem cells that can be anything, turn those cells into new retina cells that the macular degeneration, had damaged, they degenerated. So then putting the new stem cells into the eye to give people new, macula cells into their retina. And it's really, it's very sci-fi. I'm guessing there's some of that going on with these stem cells that they're turning into brain tissue and then using in conjunction with like the silicone chips. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating, scary like it's pretty creepy. I mean, it kind of makes your stomach turn a little bit, or at least it does mine, thinking about it a little bit too much. It felt so similar to what I was learning about, how alchemists were trying to create these homunculi and create like, oh, take this little combination of cells and get them to do these things and train them through this, like training the AI algorithms. And I'm like, man, we really, history repeats itself. We repeat ourselves with the same underlying theme. We just are trying so hard to take the shortcut, trying so hard to increase efficiency, increase output. It's a really interesting and scary time. I would sadly bet that at some point in the future, I don't know when, but we could be at a place where we can use our own brain tissue for computing power, sell our brain tissue, sell some kind of biomaterial that they end up using to create these chips that do certain things. I don't know, man. It's pretty freaking crazy if you ask me. I don't know if I want to be involved in that. That's just it's along those lines of playing God a little bit too much. The ethics are going to be really complicated. The United States National Science Foundation says that ethical biocomputing is the goal. And I don't know what the ethics of brain tissue cells are. It's a bit bizarre. I'm going to have some links to some really interesting organoid intelligence articles that you can access in the show notes. If you want to go down this rabbit hole, go for it. If you're scared, then don't. But I'm going to have that so you guys can look into it. I'll have the page for the Guinness World Record homunculus page. Yeah, I don't know what vetting went involved in that. It's just kind of bizarre. But to close this out, I want to give a final little recap of how I feel it's undeniable, this bridge between the way we create. Again, I've said it many times. I'm just saying this as being open to talking about it as if it was real. I am not saying there were little homunculuses in glass balls. I'm not making any claims. I'm just presenting it. Undeniable parallels between homunculus and AI. Homunculuses are biologic, made with animal materials. Homunculus are a physical, biological creation. AI, up until a certain point, was purely digital, but now we're getting into AI with biomaterials as well. That could be another similarity. We have to train it. We have to train the AI, the algorithms. Had to train the homunculus. They were used for creating art. Homunculus, AI, similar in that way. Future telling. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there using AI right now to try to predict what stocks to invest in. One thing that I think is a bit different is that homunculus were not accessible to the public. They were kind of like a basement dwelling situation, and these crazy alchemists were in their labs trying to make these creatures. I don't think it was widespread if it were real, but with AI right now, we all have access to it, even if it's unwanted, like going onto Google and getting the Gemini output that we didn't ask for. So it has really skyrocketed in that way. And both very much so a part of the culture of storytelling. Before our time, there were sci-fi books about homunculus, ones that escape and then come back to murder their master and various little things like that. And there's obviously a lot of lore and storytelling and sci-fi writing about AI and it getting sentience and turning on humans. And so I think that is very similar as well. Yeah, so I'm stating my case. We have repeated some history here. We have launched it a little further than the homunculus were, but yeah, this is a pretty bizarre episode. And so I appreciate you guys following along if you're still here because we went places and history is weird. And again, when I first learned about this, I was like, this person's bonkers. The person I overheard talking about it, this is bonkers. I knew what a homunculus was. I knew what a cortical homunculus was. It's just a tool for learning what areas of the brain have more brain space for like hands, like I was mentioning earlier. And so then learning that there's some serious lore and history behind this. There's really so many things out there that we have yet to uncover and learn. So it's always fascinating for me as someone who likes to learn a lot. I'm a lifelong learner, and then I come across a topic that I knew nothing about, and there's a lot out there. I was really into the rabbit hole. I was going all out on the research for this one. So it was a really fascinating, queasy, weird research, even into the organoid intelligence. There's just, this is a weird one. It makes you feel a little bit weird, a little bit queasy. But yeah, that's life. That is life. And man, just really want to create life that can outsource their work to. It's very fascinating. And thanks for listening, guys. I hope you had fun learning about what the homunculus is, and hopefully you can use this in a really hilarious way. Maybe you'll win a trivia night question or something on this, because this is some pretty wild stuff that not a lot of people know about, and a lot of people think it's real. I don't know. I'm not saying here nor there, but it was a fascinating, weird ride to learn about. I'll say that. And I hope you had a great listen, and I look forward to having you guys join me again for another Nad Knows podcast.